Welcome to another episode of the Future of the Future podcast. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Carter Cliff, the CEO of Papillon Therapeutics, a pioneering company advising genetic medicines for life-threatening conditions. In this episode, we'll delve into the realm of cell replacement therapy, a groundbreaking approach in regenerative medicine that involves replacing damaged or dysfunctional cells with healthy ones. This therapeutic strategy holds immense potential for treating various diseases, including certain types of cancer and degenerative disorders. We'll explore the latest advancements, ethical considerations, and the future trajectory of this promising field. Join us as we uncover the transformative possibilities of cell replacement therapy with Carter Cliff, whose leadership at Papillon Therapeutics is at the forefront of these medical innovations. Carter, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mateo. It's great to be here.
Carter, let's start with the basics. I already said you're the CEO of Papillon, but tell us a little bit more of what do you do today for a living?
Yeah, I've been working in the field of what are called quote unquote advanced medicines, which encompasses a range of different medicines that have been developed, which use genetic correction or cell replacement therapy, or as many people are familiar with, for example, the RNA-based vaccines. These are all kind of advanced medicines that represent a type of medicine that just really hasn't been developed historically, but yet they offer a lot of promise for conditions where there really aren't any treatment options. So that's primarily what I've focused on over the last 10 or 15 years and continue to do that today.
Very good. And what is cell replacement therapy? How does it work? Where does it work the best and why?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a new approach in the sense that bone marrow transplant has been a treatment for quite a long time that's been successful and widely deployed for a range of different conditions, mostly in oncology, where patients, need to have their marrow replaced after chemo. So that is an originating form of cell replacement. You could also consider, for example, blood donation. Essentially, you're just trying to restore a cell type that's normally present in the body, to its normal function. But where it has kind of a special application is that many degenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease or blinding disorders or various other types of degenerative disease like diabetes, for example, type 1 diabetes, are conditions where there's a well-known cell or class of cells in the body that are associated with the disease condition or the symptoms, or are known to be the cause of the degeneration, for example. And so when drug developers are developing medicines for these types of conditions, examples of which would be Parkinson's disease, or as I mentioned, diabetes or heart failure, usually the drug companies would be developing a small molecule or an antibody drug to try to protect those cells or to alleviate the symptoms of the condition. And so with cell replacement therapies, the goal is a little bit different in the sense that for example, in Parkinson's disease, that there's a degeneration of the dopamine neurons, which are necessary for normal function, motor function, and other brain functions. And the scientific and medical community has come to understand that these dopamine neurons degenerate in the patients, and this is cause of the disease. And so the idea there, for example, is to try to manufacture those dopamine neurons and then be able to transplant them back into the patient, and in doing so to restore function to the patient. And so those kind of cell replacement therapies that are in development are engineered like a drug product, and they're really just now getting into clinical trials. So it's a very new approach.
So this is a therapy that has existed for a while in its I don't want to say analog, in its, transplanting existing cells, right? You
Mhm.
take cells that exist in the body or someone else's body and you transplant them, right?
Yep.
But the groundbreaking approach here is you are creating cells in a lab and then
Mhm.
putting those into a human, basically.
Yeah, and I would say, initially in a lab, but later in a clinical, what they call GMP manufacturing kind of factory, basically.
Right.
Um, so yes, that the way you described it is certainly a good way, to describe it.
And is there a future where you can find a way to have those cells grow inside the body, because you're now you're building them outside the body and then putting them in the body?
Yep.
um, is there a way to have them grow within the body, stimulate
Mhm.
somehow that growth?
Well, that is sort of what the goal of the traditional therapeutic medicines would be, to develop a small molecule or an antibody or a protein that can either protect the existing cells that remain, which are degenerating, or to elicit the growth of new cells. The latter is not something where there's, I would say, much progress yet, but certainly groups are working on ways to try to have quote unquote regenerative medicine in vivo or in the body.
Right.
Um, I think that's very likely, to be successful at some point. An example of medicines, for example, that are very commonly used for blinding disorders are anti-VEGF antibodies, which are injected into the eye, and the purpose is to, reduce the effects of this growth factor on the degenerative process in the eye. And so that's an example of where an off-the-shelf, medicine that's been developed by multiple companies, large pharmaceutical companies, is widely used to try to slow down the progression of retinal degeneration in patients that have macular degeneration, for example. But what we're trying to do generally with these approaches is to anatomically or genetically correct, this deficit that's developed either from an inherited genetic deficit, or if it's a degenerative condition where the cells and the tissue itself are lost, then I think it's more likely in the short term. My bias is that it's more likely in the short term to be successful that you manufacture the cells outside of the body and then transplant them in. And once they're transplanted into the body, the cells, will mature and integrate with the host and so on. And that's the ambition. It's just
Right.
now being evaluated clinically, so it's still kind of early to say whether this approach, how effective is it for
Right.
different conditions. But
What are the breakthroughs that make you the happiest or most excited in this type of therapy recently? And what are the hardest parts that make you scratch your head as you look at the future of this?
okay, yeah. Well, I think the clinical data that's emerging from efforts like Vertex has programs in type 1 diabetes where they've shown that patients who receive transplanted beta islet cells are recovering and maybe are resistant or kind of relieved of the disease condition. That's an example of a cell replacement therapy. On the genetic correction, you have also companies like Vertex, but others who have, for example, developed corrections for sickle cell disease or hemophilia or other conditions, and those seem to be very effective treatments. There's still things that have to be worked out with respect to how to get the treatments to the patients and have the payers fund the treatment and so on. But I mean, those data show that these approaches do actually work. It's not just a theory and a research project. At this point,
Right.
it's commercially a product that could potentially relieve a patient of really severe symptoms when they don't have any other options. And then if I go to the projects that I've been working on, you have Papillon, which is led, scientifically by Stephanie Shirky and her group at UCSD in California. And they, she really showed in first in human clinical trial and in all of the animal studies and everything leading up to that, that she could utilize the bone marrow, essentially immune system of the body to deliver protein that was deficient in patients throughout the body. And so that's an amazing result and amazing capacity that the body has if you intervene, and the patients that are being treated now or that we hope to treat later all have, inherited conditions that lead to severe symptoms that affect multiple tissues in the body. And so that's a fairly amazing result for that, type of inherited condition. If I go to the cell replacement therapies where we manufacture induced pluripotent stem cell derived products, those are just now getting into the clinic. And I think I'm quite excited about those programs because in the case of, for example, Opsis Therapeutics working with Bayer, Blue Rock, they're entering clinical trials now, and that is a retinal cell manufactured and then delivered into the retina. The intent being to restore the photosensing cells in the retina in patients that are blind or, essentially have degeneration of that tissue. And so I'm very excited about that. And I don't want to drone on too long, but then you have cardiac cell replacement for patients with heart failure, which is what StemCardia is doing, and you have a range of other programs. So that's maybe a long answer to your question, but there's a lot to be excited about.
And so, how is we have to talk about the elephant in the room, AI, right? There's nobody podcast if we never mention AI, but let's just talk about technology. What technology advancements get you excited when you think about the evolution that will bring to this type of treatment, and why, right? Is it because there's a part of figuring out how to grow those cells that requires a lot of tinkering and computation and trying different formulas to find the right formula? Is it the hardware? I'm going to say all the wrong words, right? But the hardware, like the mechanical part of it, of building it. Is it new equipment that is going to make it easier? What it's like most exciting that you see coming, that you go like, oh, this is going to change the game?
Well, I think that the sort of revolution in machine learning tools that are available will, to several of the points that you've made, what they'll enable people to do is to sort of write biology before they test it. An example would be that you have, for example, what people are familiar with CRISPR-Cas9 based gene editing.
Yep.
And that is something where it's highly enabling in one sense, in that, for example, what Dr. Shirky has developed and is being advanced at Papillon is a very logical way to do gene correction in patients that have a clear mutation that can be corrected, and that makes the most sense as a therapeutic strategy. But then you have to contend with the complexities of the intellectual property landscape around that. And so one of the amazing things that occurred in the recent years is that groups that are machine learning, AI, language model based experts deployed those tools to write a new Cas9, just essentially looking at the language of biology as it exists and we know it today, and just writing a new Cas9 protein that can be used. And so that's the sort of thing that you can then test with your particular what they call guide RNAs, and if you can substitute in that enzyme, then you've relieved some complexity in the therapeutic development process. So that to me, it may seem nuanced, but it's a really important kind of elephant in the room development. Another would be that when you're developing an advanced medicine or a cell replacement therapy, the candidate selection, you can't screen through, necessarily 100 million different drug candidates. So you have to use different design principles, usually guided by developmental biology. And part of that is that you need to know at each step of the manufacturing process or the lead optimization of the product, what is in, what constitutes the product at that stage. So if you're developing a cardiac cell for heart failure, for example, you need to know at each step of its manufacturing and development what is in the preparation. And the machine learning tools and the sort of big data collection comes into play there, because it's now possible to examine every cell in the preparation, to sample and examine all of the cells from the sample in a preparation and say 20% of them are at this stage cardiac progenitors and 80% of them are other cell types. And then you look a little bit later in your process and you can say, okay, now 99% of them are cardiac progenitors and 1% of them are something else. And that's what you need to know before you can advance the product.
How is the medical community reacting or being aware or being excited to or not, or being, cautious about these therapies?
Yeah, there's sort of a period in let's just say a couple of decades ago or a decade ago, in which there was sort of a hype cycle around cell therapy. And the term was broadly used for a really wide range of things. And so I think that created some confusion, and clinics were opened for treating people with unregulated treatments. And so I think probably the medical community maybe was confused by that. What's happening in recent years is that the therapies that are being developed in a more traditional manner, where you do lead optimization and you apply principles of drug development to arrive at your drug candidate, and then you test it preclinically and then in the clinic. That's what's happening now. And I don't know that other than the groups in the medical community that are at centers where they'll be testing these treatments, I'm not sure that the broader medical community, I don't know how educated they are about these new treatments that are being developed. But I'm pretty sure that, for example, if you are a clinician treating patients in a movement disorders clinic with Parkinson's disease or maybe an ataxia or something like that, you probably have some awareness that there are new treatments that are being developed which seek to replace the cell lineage that has, been dying off in the patient, or seek to genetically correct an inherited monogenic deficit in the patient directly. So you might have some awareness of that, but I don't know that the medical community writ large is too tapped into this just yet. It's a little bit too early. The clinical results are just starting to emerge, or patients are just starting to be treated.
What is the role of the public sector when it comes to these new medicines? Is it an ally? Is it someone that is going to, make it harder because of regulations and hurdles that you need to overcome? What is the role?
I think principally advocacy for the patients. When you look at the conditions that are targeted for advanced medicines first, they tend to be conditions where there just really isn't anything that pharmaceutical companies and other groups have been able to develop that can treat those patients. And so advocacy organizations form around the patient communities, with the patient communities, to really make it clear to the payers, to the regulators, et cetera, that they want these treatments, and that they believe that there's a great deal of promise in them. And so my feeling is that the public, to the extent they're aware of this, these new medicines, needs to advocate for them, because it may be that initially the treatments are developed for patients, of which maybe there's only 10,000 or 5,000 or 500 patients. But by showing that the treatment works in that patient population, it broadens the applicability of the approach to much larger indications. And so that affect everybody, or, nearly everybody. So I think that's where it kind of closes the circle with the public, is that if the public helps advocate for the development and eventual approval of these medicines, then in the long run, that's going to benefit the whole population.
What about the big players in the private sector, big pharma, etc.? What's your opinion or your experience on how they behave and how that behavior affects the development of these new treatments?
I have a positive view of large pharma and of biotech companies, because they are put in a position where they need to take a large financial and sort of time risk,
right,
to develop these technologies. And actually, although not every large company jumps in right away, many are following other biotechs, for example. They've actually, their management, scientific and clinical management, have seen the promise of these types of treatments, and often had many programs internally and many external collaborations and acquisitions and so on to try to onboard these approaches. So, for example, Novartis is developing the treatment for cystinosis that I mentioned. Dr. Shirky at UCSD under Papillon is advancing. For Opsis Therapeutics, which is partnered with Bayer, Blue Rock, that's an industry collaboration at an early stage of development. And so to me, in an ideal scenario, you're developing a new medicine or a new modality, and you can align it with pharmaceutical company interests early, and then they can bring their experts into it. I think there's always the risk, it doesn't matter if it's an advanced medicine or a small molecule, there's always the risk that a large company changes priorities, which they have to do, obviously, to meet their shareholder needs and so on. And sometimes when that happens, a program gets shelved. And additionally, one other thing that the pharmaceutical companies have been doing in recent years is they've been acquiring certain assets or programs that entered the public markets through the biotech space, but became distressed because of the downturn of market economics.
Right.
And so there is a role for the pharma companies to consolidate assets and develop them that way. So I generally have a pretty positive opinion of, about the role of the large companies in this.
Let's talk about your story. What motivated you to focus on this type of treatment? Tell me more about your story and how you ended up here and why.
Yeah, I was, for the first part of my career, in a number of different companies, mainly in kind of sales and business development of the tools that underpin development of therapeutics. And so then I joined a company that was formed by a well-known scientist in the US named Jamie Thompson, and then financed by these two brothers called the Pillais and their financial colleagues. And they built a company which was focused on manufacturing of human cells. And this is really because Dr. Yamanaka in Japan and Dr. Thompson and others pioneered the ability to harvest or to revert human cells to their embryonic-like state. And essentially, once you're able to do that, then the developmental biologists, including those scientists, could take that input material and coax it into any human cell type potentially. And so essentially it was a key moment unlocking human biology and widely recognized, subject of a Nobel and so on. So I joined the company that Dr. Thompson and the Pillais, et cetera, had created. And over time, it became apparent that the catalog of cell lineages that the company was developing had really promising application in therapeutic development as drugs themselves. And so from there, I had, with colleagues at the company, set up collaborations with key research groups that had animal models that could be test the drug candidates, for example. So that's where, in my case, I transitioned to wanting to spin out therapeutic ventures focused on those assets, and those are the programs that are now maturing into clinical development.
Very good. So you came at it from an angle of sales, business development, but what you saw was so inspiring that you wanted really to lead this type of effort in a different way, and that's what you're doing today.
Yeah, I mean, the vision that Dr. Thompson and the founders of that company and the field in general is, there was always that vision of being able to unlock human biology and develop cell replacement. It's not something, that I was the innovator on, but in the business development type of function, if you're if you happen to be somebody who tends to go off the reservation, as they say, and try to find new markets or new applications for the technology, then I think in that situation, it's inevitable that you would realize, well, we're manufacturing high purity dopamine neurons at scale to supply pharmaceutical companies with, and they're using those to develop small molecule drugs. But you go to a conference and you encounter a colleague who has been transplanting dopamine neurons into animal models and showing that they can rescue the animal models. So then you just kind of connect the dots. And from there, that's how you, in my case anyway, how you sort of step into being involved in therapeutic development.
Dopamine, so apologies for the ignorance. Dopamine neurons are creating dopamine and releasing that to the brain, or they have a different function. My super basic understanding, it's like dopamine is like a lubricant of the brain, right? And it or not, and it enables a different type of connection between the neurons.
Well, it's involved in the sort of pleasure reward response and many other functions like timing mechanisms. And I think it's always a little hard to constrain the function of a particular cell, because later on they find out that it does a number of other things. Right. Good example is the glial matter of the brain was for some time thought to be have one function, but it turns out it has a whole range of other functions. And so I think, to put it simply, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's one of several neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitter is sort of self-described term that it's the transmission chemistry of the brain. It's part of that transmission chemistry, and so it's needed. It's needed, and it has to be regulated. And these are a type of neurons that are relatively rare in the brain, but they're needed to regulate the function of that particular neurotransmitter. And so in conditions where there's a progressive loss of dopamine neurons, Parkinson's is probably the most well-known condition, but there are others. You sort of lose the function that's natural in the brain of this neurotransmitter, and by replacing those neurons, you're trying to restore this dopamine neurotransmitter functionality. I might have made it more confusing to people in explaining that, but it really deserves, that question honestly deserves somebody to answer it who is actually a domain expert in dopamine neurons. So I'm trying to be careful.
I like the answer anyhow. I like the answer. Yeah. And it's clear that there's so much about enabling that connection that then will affect motor diseases like Parkinson, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
What do you think when you think about the future of medicine? What do you think? Like, my kids are 9 and 7, right?
Mhm.
Um, what will they see in the future? I feel like a lot is coming. A lot of things will change drastically
Yep.
when they grow up and when they see me grow up. Are we seeing like a life expectancy really going from to the hundreds, and a lot of changes coming? Do you see that, or what do you see?
Yeah, I don't know. I would say that there is certainly very legitimate science that's underpinned by large amounts of financing in companies like Altos, for example, that are really focused on health span. How can you make sure that the longevity one has is a healthy longevity instead of sort of getting very old and very, very sick.
Right.
And then there's the other question of just, like, can you fundamentally adjust lifespan? And I don't, I have a lot of thoughts on that, and probably it's almost like a separate
Right.
conversation. But I think that cell replacement therapy or anatomical genetic correction, these technologies have a clear role in that health span, is going to be defined by what particular tissues are either degenerating in a patient, if they're getting a neurologic degeneration disease at an old age, or if they're getting heart failure, which many people will end up, getting a form of heart failure, for example. What is actually available to slow the progression of that, to reverse the progression of it potentially, or regenerate the tissue entirely. Um, that's where these initial therapies in development are kind of the beginning of that type of technology. So I guess the short answer is that I think you have to have technologies and therapeutics in development that do gene correction, gene therapy, cell therapy, in order to have these kind of big gains in health span in the future. But there are also more disruptive potential approaches people are taking that go back to your earlier question, like, can you do some measure of reprogramming of a cell in vivo and avoid having to manufacture the cell ex vivo? So like that's another piece of
Right.
what might impact health span. I'm not sure I answered your question.
You
So
you kind of did. You kind of did. No, and I think what you hinted at is there's always a question. You know, we are getting closer and closer to, and I don't say this with one thought, one way or the other, right? But we are becoming, like God creatures in a way, right? We are creating intelligence. We are playing in a way uh, with human nature that defies the typical nature. And so, how far do you go? And that's, like you said, enough topic for another episode, right? And it's more philosophical. It's more like, okay, what are the implications of that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um,
mhm.
I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just trying to ensure that there are treatment modalities that can address um, degenerative conditions that accrue either through age or as a result of some sort of inherited condition, for example.
Mm,
I don't know. I mean, what if, like, Stephen Hawking, is known, for example, to have had ALS, and what if there were a treatment that could begin to reverse or slow the degeneration of that condition for him? What might he have been able to do additionally
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah,
astronomy?
yeah. True. Very, very, very true. Um, Carter, one last final and very random question to you. What do you do when you are not working?
play board games with my friends and family mostly.
What's your favorite one?
It's very, yeah, it's a hard question because I have a whole room full of them. I was just in San Francisco and I was with a colleague there and at a board game cafe. And I would say that there's a few designers. There's a designer, a Czech designer named Vlada Chavil, who's made a series of very innovative games that are, for me over the years have been very interesting and continue to be. And so he made a series of games that most people know code names, which is a kind of party game that he made. But there are earlier games he made, one of which is called Mage Knight, which is kind of an rigorous exploration game that you play with another player, and that probably be the favorite game that I have at the moment.
Nice. I remember, so I haven't played board games, I have to be honest, in a while, but I used to spend entire afternoons playing, I don't know how you call it in the US. It's War 2, the one that you have the world, and then you have like the different, chips in all the countries, and then you have the planes and everything. And so like
Risk. Yeah.
4 or 6 players, and we will put music in the background. We're talking the 90s probably. So fun times.
Yeah, that game is called Risk in the US, although there's a large number of iterations of it. So that's a whole genre now of games. Right. So yeah, it's a good one.
Very good. Carter, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing the time with me. Thank you for sharing your story. Everything that you're doing is very, very exciting. You have a very nice and clear purpose ahead of you, and you're doing great things. So thank you, and I hope we can get to do this again sometime in the future.
Yep. Thanks, Mateo. It's been a pleasure. Take care.